Good evening, everyone. This evening we're going to examine anti-Semitism, which many people believed had to a great extent become unfashionable and for the most part consigned to the past. Others sensed that it had always been bubbling under the surface, ready to explode. Alas, the latter have been proven to be correct. Like many other viruses, it has mutated and successfully infected a new generation of unsuspecting, unlettered, and impressionable youth. The symptomatic carriers, however, had never really left at all, while the unwitting carriers have to all intents and considerations become what I would define as functional anti-Semites. All, however, have been sucked into the delusional maelstrom of Palestinianism with all its genocidal implications. With this frame of reference, we will, of course, expand upon it as well. I would like to examine the question of who is an anti-Semite? And to that end, I have this evening with us Niram Ferretti, a political commentator and analyst from Italy, Rachel O'Donoghue, media direct critic and commentator from based in Tel Aviv, Rafael Castro, political commentator and analyst based in Berlin, Erez Modai, international business lawyer and analyst based in Tel Aviv, and last but not least, David Lange, owner and editor-in-chief of Israeli Cool. Okay, very welcome. You're all very welcome. And let's kick off and let's delve right into this matter. Perhaps we'll start with Rafael Castro Martinez. Rafael, in your opinion, what is fueling this new variant of anti-Semitism? And then we'll try and find out which categories we can assign to the various types of anti-Semites.
First of all, thank you very much. I agree with you that it was always latent, but it was unacceptable. So people were very guarded in what they said about Jews, especially critically. You sense this hostility not so much in what they said, but in what they didn't say. So, for example, if you praised Israel or you said something positive about Jews, the answer would be like a polite silence. And you could therefore infer that there was an animosity which couldn't be expressed, but that was, stored inside. What we're seeing, and is particularly depressing, is our developments in America, developments especially on Ivy League campuses, because I studied on an Ivy League campus 20 years ago, and the scenes and the rhetoric that have become common today would have been unthinkable back then. Much has been said about the impact and influence of money from Qatar and other Arab states. I don't really think that is a problem. I don't think that is the real root of the phenomenon. The real root, I think, is the fact that an entire generation of Americans in the last 2 decades has been raised to be ashamed of America, of American history, to see America not as a great nation, but as a society built on genocide and on slavery. And in framing any conflict between two populations in which one is darker and poorer and the other is less dark and wealthier, as in always like the whiter side always being guilty and at fault. We
Excuse
saw
me
this.
if I interrupt you.
Yeah.
So you seem to attribute it to an overarching framework of victimhood, and then this is the prism through which people view.
No, not yes, but that's not the victimhood. What is really harmful this hysteria for against Israel is that especially white, affluent, well-educated young people feel guilty about themselves. And when you feel guilty about yourself, about your past, you try to get rid of the skills.
Hmm.
And it's far easier to say, okay, we need to stop the genocide in Gaza, we need to stop American aid to Israel, we need to stop supporting Zionism, than to basically, pay reparations to African Americans or to surrender your home and that of your parents to Native Americans. So we're seeing the effects of this collective guilt feelings being basically outsourced on Israelis and on the Jewish state.
I see. David, would you like to comment on that or express some views of your own on this current phenomenon?
Well, absolutely. So I think everything that's been said until now is very true. But I just want to take a bit of a step back and maybe frame things a little bit differently. First of all, the term anti-Semite, as it appears in the title to this podcast, I don't like it. So let's just put that out there, especially with the hyphen, but even without the hyphen, because it sort of opens up, first of all, it sort of obfuscates that it's really Jew hatred. And we see a lot of times our ideological enemies trying to sort of do a play on words and say, well, we're the Semites. So I think what I would like to see, maybe I'm jumping ahead a bit, is that we refer to it universally for what it is, which is Jew hatred. And Jew hatred, of course, has been around since the Jews. We see it in the Bible, from day one. And on a metaphysical level, maybe we don't all believe in this, but from my point of view, Jew hatred is something that was put into the world by God. It actually has dual purposes. On one hand, we look at it as a very bad thing. I spend my whole, 24/7 fighting it. But at the same time, I do recognize that if it wasn't for Jew hatred over the ages, the Jewish people may not still be around due to assimilation. So it does have this, and maybe it's controversial to say it, and I certainly don't see it as a good thing, but it does have this sort of galvanizing effect on the Jewish people. So that's sort of framing things a little bit differently. But of course, if you look at, ideologies and geopolitics and what's going on now, what we see currently, which is going on in the world, is sort of let's say, a post-Holocaust strain of the anti-Semitism virus, meaning the way that I see it is that after the Holocaust, there was some sympathy in the world for the Jewish people. And it just took some decades for that sympathy to slowly erode. But before anti-Semitism could raise its ugly head as pure, unadulterated anti-Semitism, as we're seeing it more and more now, especially on social media, I think there is a difference between now and since October the 7th and pre-October the 7th, where it was more, let's say, hidden by anti-Zionism. We're seeing more, gravitating more and more towards full-on blatant more explicit, exactly. And part of that is, framing us as the new Nazis. We have sort of, we've lost the sympathy that should have been due to us due to the Holocaust. It's sort of like the statute of limitations has expired on that, and now it's full-blown anti-Semitism.
Right. Oh, that's an interesting perspective. Certainly, I'm not so sure it was such a sudden thing. I used it in the preface, of course, bubbling under the surface. But I think it was probably more present than that, and I think it's been building up for a long time. And I think we have an ideology which has been pushed to the fore, namely Palestinianism, which has provided a vector which is in itself a virus. But anyway, we'll expand upon that in a while. Yeah, sorry, you want to comment on that?
No, I mean, no, you're right. It's like, I look at it as a sleeper cell, meaning I don't think it just exploded. I think it was always, you're right, it was bubbling under the surface, but the time wasn't right to expose it to the surface.
Yeah, exactly. Rachel, any thoughts on what's been said or anything new to add?
I would agree with David. I think that anti-Semitism has always been present. For me, and I see obviously in the work that I do as a media critic, it's about which vehicle it can latch itself upon. At the moment, it's Islamism, which is, I often find it's the elephant in the room when I'm talking to people, and that is how it has spread so widely. It's so vociferous today. So, but back then, it finds a vehicle in which it can have power.
Indeed.
So anti-Semitism is always there.
Let me just interject briefly, and I apologize. Palestinianism, to all intents and purposes, has been that factor. It has been I believe it's the retrovirus to Islamism.
Palestinian, yeah, of course, it's merely a sort of a shield, I suppose, for radical Islamist ideology. It's a way of presenting it as quite palatable to Westerners. These are poor, downtrodden people. It's quite literally, we talk about Qatari money flowing into American universities. This is not about Palestinians, Palestine. This is about spreading radical Islam around the world. It is the goal of Islamists. And I would say that is what needs to be addressed if we are to have any real chance at addressing anti-Semitism.
Indeed, indeed. Niram, welcome. Good to see you again. Any thoughts on what you've just heard? Niram? Have we lost Niram? Niram's frozen. Let's pass on. Niram, are you there? Let's pass to Erez. Erez, any thoughts on what you've just heard? Anything you'd like to expand upon? Any further insights? Of course, we could all leave.
First of all, of course, I agree with my fellow panelists. But in order not to be the boring person on the panel, I'd like to play devil's advocate for a few minutes. I want to understand, and I struggle to understand, the root and the sources of the hatred for Jews. Now, I was struggling to find any facts that could theoretically raise such hate, and the only things I could come up with were the fact that Judas betrayed Jesus, and Judas becoming synonym to a traitor and synonym to Jew and Judean created some atmosphere that blames all Jews for the death of Jesus. For some reason, Romans are exempt from that. They must be, some lenience here. But in any event, it's perceived as reflecting on all Jews. That's one thing. That's theoretically an historical fact. Not that all Jews are to blame for the death of Jesus, who was born a Jew to Jewish parents, and only, I want to say, centuries later was recognized as the father of a different religion. But theoretically, I could understand it in some level. Another source is the Black Plague, where Jews, due to the isolation of their communities and millennium-old commandment to wash hands before eating, were somewhat less affected by the plague, by the Black Plague. If I were a Gentile, quite a few centuries before the discovery of microbes and viruses, and I would see that theoretically would have constituted a reason for hate. These people know how to protect themselves, but they don't allow us to enjoy the benefit of this knowledge. The third thing that came to mind was that at the time that the Jews were banned from engaging in any productive profession or owning land, Jews resorted to lending money to earn their livelihood. And nobody likes the lender. Nobody likes the bank when it comes to foreclose. Nobody likes someone to remind you of your failures, to earn your money, or to return your debt. So these are three reasons that theoretically could justify Jew hatred. And I almost would like to put them aside outside of the discussion about anti-Semitism. I feel that anti-Semitism is everything that is constructed on the sentiment of hate that these three and maybe other elements have been a base to, and these are outright lies and rejecting facts, rejecting any logical thought, because hatred seems to justify everything.
I
For
think you
example,
mentioned, excuse me if I interject, you mentioned something very important, and I think certainly there's a very strong irrational, hysterical, and a sense of delirium associated with anti-Semitism. So I think to define it in necessary and sufficient conditions, it becomes very difficult. I think you've mentioned some very important facts, and certainly we see a stratification of elements from early Christianity, a stratification from early Christianity through to the modern period. And of course, we have the word anti-Semitism itself, which is developed in Germany under Wilhelm Marr. So it has been stratified, and as we can see empirically, it mutates. I think this is a very important element, and it develops into this sort of hysterical framework, which doesn't really have a rational explanation. I think over the course of years, it has become, even today, we see people who speak about, in its modern variant, the Palestinist variant, and you're not dealing people who are on a cognitive level which I would describe as normal. I would define it as Palisteria. Okay, I think we're looking at something, a new variant. Okay, and I think it's, to a great extent, it is a Pavlovian reflex, because very often now Christians, our greatest supporters are very often Christians, so they've come to terms to a great extent with their history, and their theology has undergone reinterpretation to a great extent. So I think that there's a little change. Something has changed, but we have the constant of something that cannot be totally rationalized. Niram, we lost you for a minute. Would you like to chip in with your thoughts? Niram?
Yes, sorry about that. It's my connection. Well, I think that yes,
Go ahead.
yes, I'm here.
Go ahead.
Do you hear me?
Yes, go
Yes,
ahead.
I think that of course, the issue is very complex, and as you said before, Marco, here that we have different levels overlapping one on the other. And first of all, we might say this, using this metaphor, that anti-Semitism is a sort of geological stratification. So we have different levels of anti-Semitism. We have the most ancient level of anti-Semitism, and then we have new levels of anti-Semitism that grow and sort of build upon the oldest level. So we have this sort of geological stratification from antiquity up to nowadays. Now, what I would like to say is that, of course, we have the possibility to acknowledge, to recognize a specific form of anti-Semitism which have remained the same throughout the centuries. And there is a constant about anti-Semitism which will always be there. We have a change in the forms, in some of the forms, in some of the vestments of anti-Semitism, but not in this core, in this core basic essence of anti-Semitism, which is considering Jews as demons, considering Jews as because this comes exactly from demonology in the Christian view, in the old Christian view. In the Muslim view, it's slightly different. When we start talking about demonology, for example, one of the foremost scholars of the phenomenon, Norman Cohn, in one of his books, which is dedicated to the protocols of the older of the elders of Zion and the build up of this libel against Jews. In the preface of this book, he states very clearly that when we start talking about anti-Semitism, as you said before, there is a complete level of irrationality, and there is also a level of psychic regression, and there is also a level of demonology, because Jews were considered to be people that were not exactly human beings. They had occult powers, they had superpowers, they could do things that other people were not able to do. Sorcery, for example, was something which about which was one of the foremost accusations against Jews. Sorcery, poisoning wells, and then we have one accusation that is still very, very up to date and has been updated in relation to Israel, which is the blood libel. The specificity of Jews of killing babies in the Middle Ages. This was, of course, referred to Christian babies. They were killed in order to use the blood for making matzot. And this was the accusation. It started in 1114 in Great Britain, in Norwich, with the disappearance of a 12 years old boy called William of Norwich was then called, and it arrived up to the Renaissance. And the most famous case that we have about the so-called killing of a Christian baby, in order to take his blood, is in Italy, in Trent, in 1545, and we have the disappearance of an infant, which was then found dead, and the local Jew community, which was made of 15 people, were accused of being the murderers, and under torture, they said, of course, that they did kill the baby.
We're losing you, Niram. We're losing you. Try and get your connection back. I just want to throw an idea.
It's interesting, though, that Niram said that it was such a small Jewish community, because while we're talking about manifestations of anti-Semitism, I've always been of the belief that actually anti-Semitism is as simple as that Jews are small. They're a minority. They don't proselytize. And they tend to be, and again, I mean, because, as you said, Jews were traditionally excluded from certain professions, they had to go into other ones. And so therefore, there's a perception that there are lots of Jewish lawyers, or there are lots of Jews in Hollywood. And the idea is that why should a group that numbers this many million, who don't seek to make people join, like Islam and Christianity, why should they be successful? Why should they have these things? To me, or that's how I've seen it. And because we talk about these ancient libels, and I'm thinking, kids in universities in the US, they don't know about William of Norwich. I mean, half of these kind of ancient anti-Semitic tropes, they're not even familiar with. Yes, they might, absorb them somehow. But
but that's the point. That's the point you see. The point you see. It's the impulse that is. I think Niram is saying this, that the impulse from this stratification is so embedded that it is a Pavlovian reflex. So when something is misattributed to the Jews, they can latch onto it. Sorry, Rafael, you wanted to say something?
Yeah,
go ahead.
I would like to point out something that I think is important. Jews are perfectly qualified to describe the effects, the impact, the pain of anti-Semitism, but you're not really qualified to understand its causes, because you cannot really feel it and understand, its emotional and intellectual power. What Niram said about the demonology aspect is very true. What Rachel says about, this inability of the nations to explain and account for your success is also very true. And the bottom line is that it's all rooted in your chosenness. Whether this chosen is religious, Mount Sinai, or it's historical, the nations believe that you're chosen much more than you yourselves believe it or want to believe it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. David, do you want to
And
comment
that's why
something?
you often get this
Yes.
approach.
David's going to comment. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, no, I think I understand trying to, in a sense, understand it, but I really do, I want to pick up on what I think you said, Marco, before. It's not rational. So we can look at all different, and all these reasons do play a part, for sure. These are more kind of logical reasons and, temporal reasons for anti-Semitism in the world. But there are also many reasons which are sort of contradicting. There's anti-Semitism because we're perceived to be the rich ones, capitalists. On the other hand, we're the ones that are behind, communism and Marxism and every sort of, social justice movement. So you only get so far in trying to understand it. Unlike other hatreds, which I think are easier to pinpoint, I really do believe, and I go back to my, initial comments, that there is a more metaphysical, spiritual reason for anti-Semitism. I know not everyone necessarily will agree with that, but for instance, what I've always found interesting is with Christian theology, when they look at Jesus, they use Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. That's a very pivotal text. Whereas in Jewish tradition, if you look at all of Isaiah, the Jewish people are referred to in the singular. And it's kind of, I've always found it very ironic because that text could, in some indirect way, have led to Christian anti-Semitism over the years. But in a way, you can look at that text as a sort of a promise or prediction of God putting anti-Semitism in the world, that the Jewish people are the suffering servants of God.
Yes,
and,
no, I'm familiar with that argument.
Yeah. So basically, to cut a long story short, I believe anti-Semitism, it's not rational. And I know that might seem like a cop-out in some senses. And all the factors that have been described now do, in a more immediate sense, lead to anti-Semitism. And there is this stratification. I agree with that argument. But at the end of the day, I think there's always going to be anti-Semitism in the world until, we live up to our role as the chosen people. Which has nothing to do with superiority, which ironically is also latched onto by the Jew haters to sort of single us out. But it's really our moral responsibility in the world.
That's really true. I want to latch on to something which you did say.
Marco, I would like to make an important clarification because, David, I think we need to distinguish, I do think anti-Semitism is not justified, but I really do think it's rational and that you can understand it. Now, returning to what I was saying, there are other nations like the Hungarians, like the Armenians, like the Poles, like the Japanese, who also think they're chosen. But no one holds that against them. Why? Because no one believes it. Okay? Except themselves. But Christians and Muslims and all the other nations that see themselves as chosen fear or believe that Jews are chosen. I'll tell you I was raised Catholic, and I remember very clearly around the age of 5, someone told me that Jews had killed Jesus. Now, for a Christian kid, if Jesus is God, who can kill God except for something satanic? Okay, and that's basically when this idea that Jews have metaphysical, significance was implanted in me, and in millions and hundreds of millions of Christians throughout history. And in the Muslim world, this wasn't the case until the success of Zionism, which is very hard to account for according to the Quran, which promises success to Muslims, even though they're in far smaller numbers. And the only way to explain this from an Islamic framework is to attribute demonic powers to Zionists, who, thanks to being in cahoots with the Shaitan, are able to defeat the good heroic Muslim armies.
There's something to point taken. I just wanted to pick up something which David said, because we have to be a little bit careful about what we say as well, in the sense certainly early Christianity and up until the Middle Ages, to a great extent the early Renaissance period, there were certainly great anti-Semitic impulses, but on the other hand, we have to recognize that also much of it has been reinterpreted, and
Oh, of course.
And from an empirical point of view, many of the people who saved Jews during the Holocaust were believing Christians. And we can look at we have examples from France, from Italy, from Poland. And Poland was a place where people who, to save Jews, risked their lives. Anybody caught saving a Jew would risked having not just being executed, but having his whole family wiped out. So we have to be a little bit careful. Many people save Jews because of their Christian beliefs.
Oh, we don't even have to go back. We don't even have to go back to the Holocaust. I mean, of course, there are obvious examples. But if we look at today, the Jewish people's biggest supporters amongst the Christian community. So that's clear as far as I'm concerned.
Certainly. I would also like to raise something else, a little bit more provocative, about a lady who founded a movement called Zegota in Poland during the Second World War, with a specific aim of saving Jews. Her name was her Cossack Juska, and she was actually an anti-Semite, by the way. Okay, now this is one of the interesting aspects, and I would like to examine this, and I'm being a little bit provocative. Okay, this lady professed anti-Jewish views prior to the war and during the war, but nevertheless, she went out of her way to save Jews, and she risked her life, and she saved thousands of Jews within this movement called Zegota. But she was a nationalist Catholic who viewed the Jews with some hostility. So I put this question to you: is it better to have anti-Semites of this sort rather than fair weather philo-Semites, which there are quite a few? And I believe even nowadays we have many people who say they're not anti-Semitic except for this, that, and the other reason. But at the end of the day, I believe during the Holocaust, if they had lived during the Holocaust, they would have fallen into the bystander category in the best of circumstances.
Of course, it's better to have her and people like her.
Okay.
I mean, this goes without saying. I'm sure, and I'm not going to say that many people have said, I'm not saying about what, but have said things about groups of people, or we've said unwise comments, we've said pejorative remarks, whatever it might be. It's about what our actions are that truly are the measure of a person.
Indeed. Now, let me say a little. I want to delve into this subject. You see, because for many years we had a facade of philo-Semitism. We had Holocaust memorials built all over the place. We had these what do you call them? What do you call these stones which are placed? Rafael, you're a German speaker. The stones that are all these stones that are placed to commemorate Jews. They become all the rage all over Europe. But on the other hand, and I think more importantly, we've had governments and we have states wherein anti-Semitic literature has been taught under the umbrella of Palestinianism, a phony cause. Okay, so I think this is something very problematic. And I believe that what has happened within the so-called liberal democratic countries of the Western world has to a great extent fueled the current wave of anti-Semitism. Niram, if we have you, I'd like to hear from you on that.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Yeah.
Well, this is absolutely without question. It's absolutely without question. Now we are witnessing one of the greatest surge of anti-Semitism since the end of the Second World War. We have statistics. It's not a question of opinion. It's not a question of point of view. We have statistics. We have an overwhelming surge of anti-Semitism in France. We have attacks, incidents in most of Europe, not only Europe, and of course in the United States. And
Niram,
we have
Niram, let me interrupt you just for 1 second, because we've had a comment from a person there who wants us to name countries where these instances have taken place. And I think we can give her quite a few instances. There have been attacks against Jews. There have been murders of Jews in France. So if this lady is listening, we can certainly supply documentation to this effect. Murders,
absolutely.
discrimination right across Europe, students being harassed. This has been happening for decades. We had the horrible murder of a young man called Halimi years ago in France, and we've had numerous cases of murder in France. So to that
So
lady,
a Holocaust survivor murdered in Paris.
Indeed. So for this lady who's
Numerous.
asking this question, we should like to invite her to document herself a little bit more, and perhaps she'll get some further insight. But certainly, fire away with the comments. Thank you, Niram. I go ahead.
No, absolutely. As Rachel was saying, she was talking about, she was mentioning, I suppose, the Mireille Knoll, who was killed in Paris some years ago, and of course by an Arab, because what we also need to say, unfortunately, but this is exactly what happened, that all these aggressions in France, and when we are talking about murders, they have all been committed by Arabs, by Muslims. This is not a question of discrimination. It's a question of, unfortunately, of statistics. We have the cases. We can prove this. But I would like the killing of a young couple in Washington. So we need to talk about what happened exactly a few days ago. These people were killed at the Jewish Museum in Washington, and they were killed by a person who screamed before he killed them twice, "Free Palestine." And after the murder was committed, he said clearly, he shouted, "I did this for Gaza." So now we need to understand that anti-Semitism today is mainly fueled by the hatred towards Israel and by the conviction that by killing people, Jews, justice is put forward. So this is what we need to understand and what we need to face today exactly. And let's not forget that this idea, this basic idea, that by killing Jews, justice is made, is exactly what motivated Adolf Hitler in the 40s. He was absolutely clear about this. By killing Jews, by eliminating completely Jews, justice was made, not only for the German people, but for all the world. So this is exactly what's going on nowadays, luckily on a far smaller scale, but it has changed. But the aim is exactly the same as it was before. So this is something we need to understand very, very clearly. If we read the Charter of Hamas of 1988, it is clearly stated in that it's a genocidal manifesto.
Indeed.
It's a genocidal manifesto. It talks about jihad. It talks about Jews, about the elimination of Jews in all of Palestine. So this is what we need to understand, and it is exactly what they tried to accomplish on the 7th of October. If they were not stopped, if they had the means to do it, they would have killed every living Jew in Israel.
Now that you're
not just in Israel.
Go ahead, Erez.
Not just in Israel.
No, not just in Israel. Of course not. Of course not. Of course not.
I would like to offer, with the help of my fellow panelists, I would like to offer the unself-aware anti-Semite a few indication of his illness. because ultimately we are trying to convince people that there is anti-Semitism, and people may be themselves inflicted by it, but still live in denial. So maybe we should also discuss the symptoms.
Because presumably the biggest trick that they did was they managed to convince people that anti-Zionism is separate from anti-Semitism. They are the same thing. To be anti-Zionist is to be an anti-Semite. They are not indistinguishable in my mind. And
No,
this is the greatest thing that the other side has managed to do, is create a false distinction whereby they can get away with stuff and they just change the word Jew to Zionist.
Perfect. That's very true, Rachel. But I think we have to underline one thing, that Palestinianism isn't mere anti-Semitism. It is genocidal anti-Semitism. I think it is the most virulent version of anti-Semitism we have witnessed thus far. And if we look at the DNA of Palestinianism, starting with the Mufti of Jerusalem in the 1920s and 30s, during the period of the British Mandate, right through his collaboration with Nazi Germany. Now, I see some of the people who've made comments may well not be aware of this, and I think they should document themselves. And I think they should document themselves because the Mufti of Jerusalem is a central figure in the history of Palestinianism, the most virulent form of anti-Semitism. He was a Nazi collaborator whom, by the way, at the end of the war, the British didn't want to extradite. So they basically provided a cover for the Mufti of Jerusalem. And something else that people may be interested in knowing, aside from the fact that he was a Nazi collaborator and a Nazi instigator who recruited people, Muslims in the Balkans, for the SS. And he had also planned to build a concentration camp along the model built in Eastern Europe in the Dotan Valley in Israel, in what was then Mandate Palestine. So people really need to understand the DNA of Palestinianism. Unfortunately, people have been subjected to this sleight of hand. They don't know the facts, and they're incapable of joining the dots. Sorry, whom did I interrupt? Rachel, did I interrupt you?
Yes, but you exactly. But I mean, then we would even have to pull apart the even term Palestinians.
Well, of course.
Who are Palestinians? Are Jordanians Palestinians? Jordanians not?
It is a fictitious construct. It is a fictitious construct which people have latched onto. We'll organize a podcast on that.
Yep.
Let's try and stay on topic, even though they're interconnected. David, go ahead.
Yes, so I would argue that the most virulent form of anti-Semitism, which of course has converged to what you call Palestinianism, is progressive anti-Semitism. And the reason for that, why it's so virulent, is not only it's actually in essence genocidal of the Jewish people, and doesn't see us as human or deserving of human rights, but at the same time it paints itself as anti-genocidal and pro-human rights.
Well, yes, it's called.
That's what makes it very, very virulent, in my opinion. I've always been less concerned about right-wing anti-Semitism in the sense that, I mean, nowadays, right? Because they're very clear about who they are. And the majority of people who supposedly care about human rights, they're an anathema to them. They'll steer clear of them. Whereas this progressive anti-Semitism almost attracts people towards it because of the way it paints itself as pro-human rights.
Indeed. Rafael,
you're right though, David. It's how do you fight a kind of that have managed to unite sort of feminists, Islamists, LGBT movement, liberals, the whole, and I'm thinking of such disparate groups becoming bedfellows. How?
Yes.
And it's anti-Semitism. There is no other explanation for how these groups could ever unite over anything.
There is no logical explanation. There's no.
Well, there is somewhat of a logical explanation if you look at neo-Marxism and what your comments someone mentioned at the beginning about this white brown person power dynamics. This is a manifestation of that. Now, of course, the jihadi, fundamentalist Islam, anti-Semitism, and that should not get along. You're right. But they get along because of the common ground, which is an antipathy towards Jews, but also the West.
Identity politics.
It's like, no, but that identity politics is the higher level. But underneath it all is an antipathy towards the West, not just the Jews. The Jews are, let's say, symbolic of the West because Judeo-Christian values are the pin of the West. And if you look at, for instance, and I don't want to jump ahead too much, like Qatari money, Muslim Brotherhood, all of that stuff, it's not necessarily aiming towards a physical Islamic caliphate, but it's more looking to supplant the West as the moral authority of the world, in my opinion, at least. So it's not just about, it's Jew hatred, yes, but you can't ignore the fact that it's also hatred of Western civilization.
Certainly, no, absolutely. Go ahead, Rafael.
I completely agree with David. I would like to latch on again to, the phenomenon of, increase in Holocaust, commemorations, especially in Europe, and the increase in, pro-Palestinian literature. I think the two phenomena go hand in hand. I think that, in the United States, Holocaust commemoration was very positive for Jews and very positive for attitudes towards Israel, because the Americans were, fellow victims of, European anti-Semitism. What happened is when that model was basically applied to Europe, the reaction was different because the European knows that his ancestors were in one way or another either complicit or, bystanders during the darkest days of the Jewish people. And, when you feel bad about your ancestors, about your culture, about your nation's history, it's much easier to basically find faults and flaws in, the people that your culture has victimized rather than, in making amends for it. I'll share a personal anecdote. I remember, 10 years ago when I had 20 years ago, I had already been to Israel. I spoke Hebrew. I was, a pretty hardcore Zionist. And I remember, there were scenes of one of those rounds of fighting in Gaza. There were scenes of destruction. And, instinctively, I said or I thought something that was either very strongly anti-Zionist or even anti-Semitic. And I was shocked by my own reaction because I had never had, real sympathy for Hamas or for the enemies of Israel. And, I did some reflection. And I remembered that, a couple of days before, I had seen on television an interview where an elderly lady, possibly Jewish, said that, most Italians have basically betrayed their Jewish neighbors from 1938 onwards. And, my way of processing that guilt and that, sense of shame was basically to, sympathize with the people that, were fighting Israel. And I think there's a strong correlation between, the increase in sympathies for the Palestinian cause and Holocaust awareness in Europe. And you see that in the fact that the less countries have, come to terms with, their dark history during the Holocaust, the more likely they are to be pro-Zionist and pro-Israel.
That's certainly a very interesting point. Niram, you wanted to jump in? Niram, have we got your connection sorted out? Can't hear you, Niram.
And I completely agree on what was said until now, and I think a very important point was made. Do you hear me?
Just about.
Here I am. Do you hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Marco?
Go ahead.
Yes, what David and Rachel were both saying is that now we have this unholy alliance, which is very, very dangerous because we have wokeism going hand in hand with Islamism, and we have neo-Marxism, and all of this is all going. Is all together. They all go together because the main issue is, as David was pointing out before, it's not exactly anti-Semitism. If you tell these people, well, you are anti-Semite, they will start shouting at you, outraged, because they don't think absolutely of themselves as being anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. They are anti-Western civilization. This is the main target. And Israel is perceived as the last, as the bastion of Western civilization, as the small Satan, as Iran says. No, Iran says that the great big Satan is the other United States, and the lesser Satan is, of course, Israel. Their battle is against everything that the West has accomplished. And of course, we have all the culture of wokeism, of victimization, and all the vitriolic criticism that we have had in all these decades against the West, which has represented the West as the worst civilization that ever appeared on the face of Earth. So now all these young people shouting at Columbia universities and then at Harvard and other universities, shouting "Free Palestine" from the river to the sea without even knowing what they're talking about, because if you mention the river and you mention the sea, they will not even say what they're talking about. They will not recognize where Israel is on a map. Well, they are shouting against themselves. They are shouting against the civilization that give them the right to study in this Ivy League, very expensive university. Is total madness, of course. It's total madness. Has been fueled by a lot of anti-liberalism, a lot of teaching has been going on, especially in high academia in the United States, but not only in the United States, for at least the last 20, 30, let's say 30 years, the last 30 years.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah.
I want to pick you up. Sorry, just give me 1 second. I want to pick you up on that because I believe you've made some very powerful statements. And I believe that Europe and Western countries, via a number of mechanisms, have been sleepwalking towards suicide, collective suicide, without realizing what is going on, of course. And I think we have to look at what's going on in the curricula and what is being taught, not just in academia, but also in secondary schools in Europe and in the West, where there is a total misrepresentation, total distortion, and to say it quite bluntly, textbooks that lie. And they do not instill a critical capacity whereby students can join the dots. So when students are confronted with facts, they are incapable of doing anything with them. And I believe this has crystallized in the recent demonstrations where people go out demonstrating about things they don't know anything about. Okay. It's all riding on an emotive impulse, which has whipped up something which I believe I define as palisteria, where people are incapable of dealing with facts and of building a coherent picture. Rafael, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to say a couple of things. The first thing is that I think that wokeism is actually a disease that is rooted in very deep racism. If you look at the societies where wokeism is strongest, they're the same societies that a few generations ago were the most racist. Why? Because it's much easier to go from a situation where the white man is a savior of humanity to a situation where the white man is guilty for all the ills of the world, than to go from a more balanced position to a more balanced position. And if you look at all the photographs, of queers for Palestine, of feminists for Palestine or whatnot, I think that most of them, are middle class white people, because those who suffer from real homophobia, those who suffer from real misogyny, know that the Islamists are not their allies. They know that what happens in Jenin. But if you live a very comfortable life, and the only homophobia you've experienced is someone misgendering you, you can think that the real ills of the world are rooted in Leviticus and what it says there about the gays. But if you live in the real world, experience real homophobia, real violence against women, you know that siding with Hamas is not the right thing to do.
So are we saying that to save American youth, America really needs a big war with conscription, and young people need to actually understand what, I don't know, what it's really like to fight against someone who wants to kill you?
No, no,
Maybe.
I don't believe in war. I think that it would be a very good start if every student, instead of getting fancy internships in Wall Street, would spend the summer tilling the soil in Nebraska. It
But
would teach
actually,
them.
I was being serious because I watched a video of a soldier who died at the age of 20 in Lebanon, and he recorded a video before he went out to fight, and he was talking about why he'd done this, well, why he was fighting and why he was looking forward to going out there. And it was such a poignant speech that he gave, talking about how the love for what he's leaving behind is much greater than any kind of hate, quote unquote, for an enemy. And he was eloquent and it was stunning. And I thought, he's 20 years old. And I couldn't picture a US college student giving a similar style speech. And I thought, actually, maybe if, there was an enemy bearing down on America and it was your family who might die and you had to protect, maybe then you might grow up. You might think, okay, hold on, maybe there are real enemies out here and it's not this, and actually I'll put my big boy pants on and deal.
Rachel, I understand what you're saying, but if we continue this train of thought, we'll end up thanking the Arabs and the anti-Semites for making Jews and Israelis so smart and strong.
Well, but as you said, David, having an enemy in this world, and
yeah, but you know what? I don't know if it would actually help, because the level of brainwashing has been going on for so long and is so endemic, especially in the United States colleges, that actually I believe that the students, they're justifying the enemy attacking them. They're like, it's this guilt, it's this white guilt that they have, and that and they even refer to America, and it's also in Australia and elsewhere in the West. Just one second. That they refer to their own countries, which are giving them all their liberties, as settler colonies. That's how far gone they are.
But it's theoretical for them. In Israel, this is real. There are rockets, there are soldiers that die, real people die, there are real funerals that occur. I think if an American student actually saw that people die, it's not fake, there are coffins, and people don't come back, their views, this is
I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. It might be a matter of scale, because they do, of course, see American soldiers dying, and we see terrible rhetoric coming from the woke, blaming it on America and not on the real enemies. So perhaps if it was done to scale, I don't know, maybe I'm being a bit pessimistic, just because I'm so knee deep in looking at all of this stuff, that everything seems to have gone to hell in a handbasket. So
I think there's another problem in pedagogy. That postmodernism, the original philosophers of postmodernism said very wise things, but it has been dumbed down to the point where university teachers and high school teachers are telling young people there is no truth. Truth is a convention, so my truth is as good as your truth, and you have young people not bothering to research the facts, because whatever they feel is right is true, no matter if reality agrees or doesn't agree with them. And this is something systemic, and it's also rooted in the fact that the progressive pedagogy says that the last thing you can do is make a student feel sad or unhappy or hurt him by challenging what he thinks or what he believes. And some of the best experiences in my life have come from being treated unfairly, disrespectfully, and these are like character building experiences that the young generation of Westerners are no longer experiencing, and therefore they come emotionally, character-wise, and intellectually unequipped to face the complexity of the world we live in, and this influences and impacts their attitudes, their opinions, and everything else.
Can I ask a question, David? Do you have sympathy for these students? Because a part of me does. There's something unique about Israel, is that there's meaning here. And what we're doing, it's for a purpose, and there's something much
Existential.
greater than all of us. And these students, I sometimes get this feeling that that's what they're lacking. It's any purpose and meaning in life, and they seek to latch to something, a cause, because they have nothing else. And actually, if something of substance was there for them, they wouldn't be so seduced by Hamas rhetoric, and actually, they would go toward that.
Yeah, no. Look, Rachel, I think you're onto something. I think there definitely has been this emptiness in modern society. And that, yeah, I think these, as I mentioned before, why it's such a virulent form of anti-Semitism is because it's couched in human rights. So these people, these students actually think they're the good guys. We look at it and go, wow, they're espousing the most evil ideologies and they're aligning with the most evil actors on the planet. They don't see it that way. So for sure, there is something to that. And I just would like to also add, because we've spoken about the brainwashing on campuses, but it would be remiss of us to ignore the effect of things like TikTok. The University of TikTok is a huge player in this. And who owns TikTok? It's China. So, I mean, it's a rabbit hole one can go down. I'm just putting that question out there because the way that the algorithm works on TikTok, as I'm sure, Rachel, you know a lot about, with honest reporting, having, videos which are seen to be pro-Israel or talking against Hamas, struck out. That's happened to me a lot. And whereas the most virulent anti-West, anti-Semitic videos get more airplay. So yeah, we're up against the real system. It's not grassroots, it's actually top-down systemic anti-Semitism and anti-Western sentiment.
Yeah.
And there's so many players involved,
So many.
each with their own agendas.
Yeah.
That to unravel it all and to combat it, very tough.
Yeah. I also think this is a highly speculative hypothesis, but that a lot of people in academia, a lot of students in the social sciences and in the humanities are realizing that ChatGPT, invented by a certain Sam Altman, is going to make them redundant pretty soon. And what better than you basically hate Israel for all this?
Yes, the lightning rod theory, I think we're pretty well aware of. That's certainly the case. I'd like to get back, however, to what is happening on the ground within schools, within the media, within academia. Niram, are you with me? You frozen? Are you with me? Can you hear me? Yeah. We cannot divorce things from what is happening on the ground. You and I know what is taught within the Italian school system, within the universities, and we know that this can only happen with the rubber stamping of states. So we have to look at anti-Semitism on an institutional level. It's not merely individuals with prejudices, but it's state apparatus that are involved in this. What is your opinion? I see it throughout Europe, and I think you know what's happening in Italy.
Yes, of course. Well, in Italy, we have, of course, many problems in the university where a copycat of what's going on in the United States, mainly, and we have that on a smaller scale than what happened in the United States, with a big difference here in Italy because we have a different system, a different police system, a different justice system. So this problem has been just let going on. We didn't have police at a certain point standing for people who were not allowed to study, students that were not allowed to study, students that were just out of the classrooms, etc., etc. Because it happened at a certain point in the United States, and we also know what happened.
Right. Sorry, Niram. I think you have a sound issue there. There's a sound coming across. I think your mic is not working. Turn off your mic for a minute so we can check. Turn off your mic. I think, yeah, it's at your end. Okay, so we okay. So many, I believe. So I want to cover this a little bit more. I believe we have a lot of state actors in Europe. We have the European Union, who have a lot to answer for. when it comes to the spread and the poisoning of generations of young people. Rafael, can you enlighten us with regard to the situation in Germany?
I think that Germany, in terms of anti-Semitism, is one of the cleanest countries in Western Europe. And nevertheless, the education about what they call the Near Eastern conflict is very problematic for two reasons. The first reason is that all the textbooks, all the literature refers to the Holy Land as Palestine, not as Palestine slash Land of Israel or Land of Israel slash Palestine. In other words, the impression is clearly given that this is the land that belongs to Palestinians, and then it became the state of Israel, but it doesn't really belong to the Jews. But we Germans did horrible things to the Jewish people, so we have to shut up about what Israel does. The second problem is that because religion plays such a marginal role in Germany today, there is a big resistance and even an incapacity by most teachers to explain the religious significance of the land of Israel to the Jewish people and even to Christians. So you have this impression, not only in schools but also in universities, that Zionism is something that was born in the late 19th century, and that the connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is basically an invention of Theodor Herzl.
Indeed, you raise a very interesting point. So actually, we could say paradoxically, the dechristianization of Europe now is leading to anti-Semitism and a lack of knowledge about the history of the Middle East, and indeed, not to mention of Europe. I think we're seeing something of the sort. Erez, any comments?
Well, I think at the basis of diagnosing the anti-Semitic phenomenon is preferential treatment. Those students who are so moved by the plight of the Palestinians, but seem to be indifferent to 500,000 to 1 million Syrians being killed by the former regime, is the application of double standard. And double standard is not only applied to position, to let's say perceptions, but also to information. So, dear sir or madam, if you tend to shut away, ignore, and dismiss information that supports the Jewish or Israeli position, while you are not as meticulous in checking every lie coming from the health ministry of Gaza, you're anti-Semite.
Yeah, I would like to add, personally, I would love if the people who claim they're pro-Palestinian were really pro-Palestinian. If they fought for the rights of Palestinians in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Kuwait, that would be wonderful, because we all want the best for Palestinian children and for their children and grandchildren. We don't want them to be raised in hatred and misery. We want them to enjoy the same freedom and as many of the same rights that everyone else wants. So let's not call them pro-Palestinian. Let's call them anti-Israel, which is what they really are.
Yeah.
That's certainly true. Yeah. Of course, they have had the wool pulled over their eyes by this overwhelming and continuous Palestinist narrative, which has distorted their capacity to think straight, unfortunately. Very often, I think that these functional anti-Semites are to be pitied because they don't realize, they're not aware of the illness. That's the problem. When a person is ill and he realizes it, there's a possibility to recover. It's when you're unaware of the illness. Go ahead, Rachel.
This is the view that I take, Marco, and actually it's an optimistic one, because these students that I see on college campuses, I don't talk about the agitators in the kafirs who are foreign students, probably straight over from Qatar or wherever, who are organizing these things. But I see the chick in the keffiyeh with her like cute little earrings and whatnot that's gone along to this camp out. These people are not anti-Semites in any true sense of the word. They're there to join the crowd and make a difference, bro. And this is what needs to be addressed. And actually, I don't think it's helpful to brand thousands of college students anti-Semites. It doesn't help us because it makes them hate us more and go, oh gosh, they think we're like. No, actually, it would help for us to get our argument across in a far more effective manner and show them that they're siding with the least progressive people, Islamists who despise them, despise America and how they live. And if we can show that Israel is the progressive cause, then that's how we'll win. It's really just a matter of kind of framing.
I understand your point. You make a perfectly valid point. Of course, they're not anti-Semitic mens rea. I'm saying that they become unwittingly functional anti-Semites, which are no less dangerous. That's the point.
Yeah.
It wasn't as if in Europe 80 years ago people were all anti-Semitic. You didn't need somebody to be an ideological anti-Semite. You had to have a person who functioned as a cog in the machine at a certain point. This is what I'm trying to come across. But you're perfectly right. Niram, you want to chip in? Niram, sorry, let Niram.
No, I completely agree. Yes, I was just to make a footnote to what Rachel was just saying before. I completely agree with her statement. I think that these people are mainly, let's call them the right name. They're useful idiots. This is what they are mainly. So I'm optimistic in the sense that if you are a useful idiot, you can be brought back to reality. If you are a full anti-Semite, you cannot be brought back to reality.
Indeed, full blown.
Great psychological.
Indeed.
So I agree completely with what she said just before.
Right.
I beg to differ.
And also. Sorry, Iris. Sorry, go ahead.
I beg to differ because in order to bring that change about, you need to have open minds, and this is what today we don't have. That's why I said before.
That's an interesting point. Yeah.
If you're shutting out reason, if you're reluctant to examine your own views and opinions when it comes to Jews, then there's no way we could help you. You are terminally ill. I agree with you that most of those students are useful idiots or useful ignorance, but they are willingly useful ignorance.
Yeah, I think I agree with both Rachel and Erez. I think that we have to bear in mind that you can be anti-Semitic because you're ignorant, because you're stupid, or because you're malevolent. And
can I add? Yeah, sorry.
You can change the mind of the ignorant. It's harder to change the mind of the stupid. But if you're malevolent, that's a big problem. And we see this very clearly in Eurovision because our elites are basically deliberately malevolent, whereas the ordinary people, even though they read the propaganda of state television and the mainstream media, when they see a singer who sings a beautiful song, an inspiring song, they support Israel. And they are the simple people, those who don't have an elite education. But at the end of the day, the normal, ordinary people are the allies of truth and justice, and not the elites that get brainwashed by watching the BBC or attending fancy seminaries about postmodern philosophy.
Yeah. I just wanted to add something while agreeing with what Rachel said. It's a little bit more complicated in the sense that I believe that there is within many of these students, in order for them to be so, let's say, willing participants in their ignorance, this neo-Marxist ideology that they're bought into capitalizes on some anti-Semitic bigotry, which that they probably have within them, if you know what I mean. And I sort of categorize anti-Semites in different ways, meaning just because you have or you hold some anti-Semitic prejudices doesn't make you a full-blown anti-Semite. That's just a label, right? It doesn't really get us anywhere. And you can kind of tackle people with anti-Semitic prejudices differently from, like the Nick Fuentes of the world or the neo-Nazis. They're fully blown, they're beyond the pale. So I agree with Rachel there. But what I'm trying to say is it's not as simple as saying that anti-Israel sentiment has fueled anti-Semitism, yes, but it's a two-way thing, meaning the anti-Israel sentiment is triggered by underlying anti-Jewish prejudices to begin with. In many cases, that's my thesis.
I'd like to ask that this later part of the conversation be devoted to having a course of action, because I think that there is something we have to give credit to the adversary, is that they did a very good job at a grassroots level. On campuses, they worked very well with
where I would love to give a shout out to Honest Reporting's work in this regard. We do workshops with students where, and honestly, I see them coming in, they are eager to learn. And of course, these are some Jewish students. In fact, I've spoken to non-Jewish students who are actually just keen for the facts. And my experience on the ground is actually students, because they're being bombarded with all of these groups that are like, support this, do that. When they feel like they're receiving someone who's kind of cutting through it, they're actually quite receptive and far less, extreme than I think the media would have you think they are.
Indeed.
And,
Let me just... Sorry,
and I would just say, I would direct people to Honest Reporting to read about the various things we do.
I just want to make one important point. I think we're talking a lot about the anti-Semitism on campuses and online, but what I've realized is that anti-Semitism is clearly a problem. There's no question about it. I do believe there's a silent majority out there that aren't anti-Israel even, to be honest. In fact, a lot of them are just neutral. And I think a very important part of our strategy is not necessarily to make it about Israel or even the Jews, but to point out, the anti-West sentiment, because to the average person who's living in the West and enjoying all the freedoms of the West, they look at, for instance, an anti-Israel protester burning the Australian flag, or they're burning the American flag, and that really, sends chills up their spine or down their spine. Not just that, when they're protesting, you've got to point out the inconveniences and their disgusting behavior. Like when they're blocking traffic in Australia once again, they interrupted carols by candlelight. So I'm actually, in a sense, I'm not all about silencing these people. I kind of like to turn it around and go, one of our greatest weapons in dealing with this anti-Semitism are the own actions and the own words of these people. Don't silence them. Put a light on it, shine a light on it, and that's how you win over the people in the middle, or the silent majority.
Indeed,
Yeah.
indeed. No, I
completely agree. The silent majority is with us. My experience in Berlin is that I speak to blue-collar workers who are German, African immigrants, even to my Turkish hairdresser, and I can have a very constructive, honest conversation about immigration, about Islam, about economic problems in the developing world. As soon as I say the same things to an average college graduate, I get called an extremist, a racist, an Islamophobe, and I think we need to cleanse the audience stables of academia today in the West. That's a top priority.
These are all very valid points, and I believe we should
also.
Like Go ahead.
No, sorry. I was just saying just one thing. We need to realize something, which I think is very important for all of these people. Well, for Palestinians, and against Israel, they are talking in their heads. They're just having fictions. They are not talking about real Israel, and they are not talking about real Palestinians. This is what Eric Voegelin, one of the greatest political philosophers of the 20th century, called the second reality, second level reality, which is not the reality, empirical reality. It's the reality fabricated by the mind. It's the ideological reality. So when these people, they talk about Israel and they say that Israel is like, this evil country, the most evil country in the world, and they start talking about apartheid and about colonialism and about genocide, they are talking about something which has the slightest adherence to reality. And when
in philosophical terms, it possesses no existence.
It possesses no existence. And the same thing goes for the Palestinians, for the poor victims, for the Arab victims, the oppressed. This is another fiction.
That's right. Let me just say something, that we can do no greater disservice to those whom the Palestinist identity has been imposed upon by referring to them as Palestinians, because unfortunately they have been violated by this great distortion. There is no greater disservice that one can do by using this terminology. And this is the great mistake we're making, because they construct a false identity which never existed. And they're consequently, they're disoriented. For people to have a constructive lives, they have to have a positive identity. And what has happened with Palestinism is that a phony identity has been created, and hence a level of anomie, alienation has set in, which really needs to be dispelled.
I've argued this before, though, that Palestinian identity is basically constructed on hatred of Jews and Israel. Are you saying that perhaps if there was something that was positive about Palestinian identity?
No, not at all. Not at all. There is nothing positive about it. It's a phony identity.
But if there could be, because we can say it's a phony identity, it's not going to go anywhere.
Hang on a minute. The Germans 20 years ago, everybody they had Nazism imposed upon themselves. Now let me just pick you up on that, because indeed there are many people in Israel, Arab-speaking people, who certainly don't want to know anything about Palestinism. They don't want to, and it's increased. The number is increasing within the Druze community. I can assure you, an Arab-speaking community which has a much longer history in this area than the many hundreds of thousands that migrated during the British Mandate. They don't want to know anything about Palestinism, and I think this is a very important card. There's no point in appeasing this. If you fuel it, we're not going to get anywhere, neither for us nor for them. So I think we have to do some serious rethinking about that. Be very careful about the terminology we use, because by doing that, we let other people set the agenda and we restrict our room for maneuver. And we do a disservice to many people who would be potentially decent people, these children who are constantly brainwashed in this evil ideology. I mean, you know as well as I do, Rachel, what goes on in the Palestinist Authority, what they teach, the hideous, the genocidal pedagogical material there, what goes on in the media. You know as well as I do what goes on there. You can't. There's no room for compromise in this sense. They have to be weaned off this poison.
I would imagine that the same sort of denazification that took place in Germany would need to occur in the Palestinian territories.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Sorry, I would also like to urge all users watching, users of social media watching us, to refrain as much as possible in social media debates referring to the other side as anti-Semites, because it usually backfires. I've noticed that the anti-Israel people never claim that people who defend Israel are Islamophobes. They do so in Arabic, they do so in other languages, but in English and Western languages they don't do so, because
that's not true. Sorry.
No,
we're seeing it more and more. No, I'm seeing it a lot. Like it happened again. I use Australia as an example because I follow Australia very closely for obvious reasons. But we're seeing a lot, and even for instance, I think in America with Ilhan Omar or maybe Rashida Tlaib, that anytime they've been attacked for actual, anti-Israel or even anti-Semitic, like all about the Benjamins, someone has come up and said that's Islamophobia. So I don't exactly agree with you
I mean,
there. It is happening more and more.
you're right. I just think that the frequency with which our side does it, at least until very recently, was far greater, and I think it's counterproductive because that allows the other side to say, "Oh, they're leveraging anti-Semitism to criticize debate. They're exploiting this and that." And
Oh,
I
on
think,
that, yeah.
I think this is not a matter of being philo-Semitic or anti-Semitic. You just need to love truth and justice, to be on the right side.
Well, you need to be able to convey it as well and live by it. And I just want to latch onto a comment that a gentleman made about Israeli identity. Well, that's a question that is actually born of, unfortunately, extreme ignorance, Erkan, because had you studied a little bit of history, read a little bit of Bible, come to Israel, visit the country, you'll see it firsthand. We're inviting you to come here, you visit the archaeological sites. We'll have a wonderful time. Join us.
Yeah, Akan, thank you for your question. I think it was well intentioned. There's plenty of information, probably in the Jewish community in Turkey about Judaism and Israel. So, feel free to read. And if you have any questions,
And
you can
actually,
reach out to
I'm
us.
sure anyone from Turkey would love it. Istanbul is a beautiful city, having gone myself, and I think anyone from Turkey would definitely enjoy a trip to Jerusalem. Plenty
I
to
think this
see.
is I think it's actually a really important point. If I can segue a bit, anyone coming, and it's touching on a point that I think was made before, that anyone actually just coming to Israel, because these things aren't born in reality. I think it was Niram, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned that. That just coming to Israel provides somewhat of an antidote in many cases to let's say, the well-intentioned people who are ignorant. That, if, for instance, if screaming out apartheid or that Arabs don't have equal rights in Israel, actually just walking the streets, coming to the old city and seeing the interactions that Jewish Israelis have with Arab Israelis, the doctors and all of these things, it really does provide somewhat of an antidote. I'm not saying it solves everything and everyone will be convinced by that, but the genuine, let's say, the truth seekers who may have been waylaid on the wrong path, it definitely can be a big help.
I just would like to add one small detail that I think is more powerful than 1,000 words. In Israel, every Jewish male has access to an M16 because many are soldiers or ex-soldiers, and yet in every intifada and every war, it is the synagogues that required armed protection, not the mosques. What does this say about Israel? What does this say about the Jewish majority? No comment.
Indeed,
I,
the Arab community has flourished since the foundation of the state. There is no state in the Middle East in which Arab Muslim citizens have greater rights. All one has to do is visit the hospitals, visit the cafes. The Supreme Court has Arab judges. It flies in the face of all this nonsense with which all these people have been brainwashed, and they have a real problem in coming off this drug, this Palestinist drug. I know it's going to take a bit of cold turkey, but do it for your own good.
but what Rafael was saying before, I think is very, very poignant. It's very, very poignant about the access to weapons. And we know that by the records, of course, we had in 1993 during the first Intifada. Of course, there was the killing, the massacre that was carried out by Baruch Goldstein, and we continue talking about that thing in 1993, with all what happened, with all that happened afterwards, but all the killings that were done by Arabs. So what are we talking about?
And I'd like to add another detail, which I think is very poignant, comparing the security of Muslims in Israel compared to Europe. Every time there's a terror attack in Europe, be it France or Belgium or anywhere else, and I'm nice to know, like Muslims in Berlin, they're extremely friendly, extremely nicer than usual. Why? Because they feel the tension, they feel the hostility, and they're relieved that someone is nice to them despite the horrible news. In Israel, every time I've been there in the last 2 years, and I'm friendly to the local Arab Muslims, they're unfriendly. And why are they unfriendly? Because they know that nothing will happen to them if they're unfriendly. They can
Because
afford to
they're-
be, unfriendly because no one's going to spit on them or beat them or curse them. And that's the difference between, Europe and Israel. And that's the reason that, the Jewish hospital in Berlin is full of, Muslim patients, even with hijab. That's the reason that Ismail Haniyeh sent his granddaughter to be treated in a hospital in Israel. But believe me, no Muslim in Europe would freely send their daughter or grandson to be treated in a hospital run by right-wing extremists. Because at the end of the day, they know very well that the best doctors, the best teachers, and the best professionals are the Yahud. And, when push comes to shove, they know who they can trust and count on.
Indeed, indeed. Folks, any last thoughts? Any closing thoughts? I thought it was a pretty productive conversation. I think it's something we need to develop, and we shall develop in the coming weeks. I think there's some follow-on topics which I think we can propose. So I'd like to thank you all for your gracious presence. Okay, and we look forward to having you again. And indeed, if you have any ideas, we could certainly deal with those topics as well. We would like to thank our viewers who have different opinions too, and perhaps we've given them a little food for thought. And why not subscribe? Listen to something a little different. Who knows? We may even get on at some stage. Okay, so once again, thank you for your participation, whether you agree with us or disagree with us. Subscribe, share, like, and we look forward to being with you, seeing you again. Thank you very much and good evening.
Thank you very much.
Toda ve shukran. Bye bye.
Toda